would have been possible to ask somebody from the European Commission to come and defend the state aid rulings, but we've gone one better, which is to get a representative of what might possibly be the country concerned, which is Dan Shaviro from New York University.
Well, coming as I do from a land of sunshine, harmony, and joy across the Atlantic, I'm just startled by all the rancor that seems to be prevailing in the EU. So I unfortunately can't comment on any of that directly because I'll be giving a US perspective. Okay, anyway, just as an illustrative, I'll mention the Apple case. Obviously, it's one of many and they all differ. So Apple had US employees, many of them employee owners, who developed technology for products that were sold around the world. And economically, there's, I'm not talking about as law, a matter of law, economically there's no question that these foreign sales, no serious question that these foreign sales yielded US source income under an origin approach. If you asked where did the work occur, where the productive advances made. On the other hand, it would be foreign source income, I'll apologize for the acronym FSI, foreign source income under destination approach. If you think of it as where the goods are sold, well, at least it's the stuff in the EU is obviously sold in the EU. So it depends on what sort of an approach to the source of income you use. You get a clear answer either way, depending which type of theory you use. Now, existing income tax source rules usually, but not always, at least purport to rely on an origin approach. There are exceptions. I'll mention one in a couple of slides in the US rules where there's clearly a source approach being used, and that's even without regard to proposals that change US law. But Apple's EU sales yielded foreign source income for US tax purposes under something called cost sharing, and I would call this a fake origin-based approach. In other words, the US Treasury, given US law, didn't say, oh, this is foreign source income to the extent you had sales in Europe because that's where the sales occurred. There was a sort of a solemn fiction arranged that's very standard under US tax planning by the US multinationals, in which an Irish affiliate purported to pay for some of the research by using money that the Apple parent gave it 5 seconds earlier, and purported to bear the risks, even though obviously a single company, a single integrated firm, you can't really share risks, it's all one set of risks. Anyway, and under the US IRS agreed in advance that this was foreign source income. So as a matter of US law, under what purported to be an origin-based approach, it was all foreign source income for the EU and other such sales. So anyway, so you kind of think this income apparently rose somewhere, using Ireland just as a placeholder, but somewhere outside the US for US tax purposes, but as we know from the Apple case, about 99% of it wasn't taxed in Ireland either. By the way, of course, if you were asking where the sales would occur, that also wouldn't have been Ireland. Anyway, so the EC steps in and says that the Irish tax concessions are illegal state aid and improperly reduced Irish taxes by about 14 billion euros. The US Treasury issues a white paper saying, this is, I think wrong is probably the wrong word, it'd probably say novel under EU law. So this is only possible under a novel theory under EU law. Now, I'm certainly not the person to engage with the question of what's either correct or novel or not novel under EU law, because I'm not an EU tax lawyer. I kind of question whether that was the right fight for the Treasury to pick either, because it's going to be just hard for us to catch up with the superior knowledge that EU tax lawyers are going to have about EU law, including how frequently and how appropriately novel theories might be advanced. So that's sort of a question I'll stay out of, and I guess one could argue that all Americans should have stayed out of it. I also disagreed a little bit with the Treasury white paper about why this decision might be bad for the U.S. if it was. The Treasury emphasized that there would be foreign tax credits created that then, upon eventual repatriation, would reduce U.S. tax revenues. That's not completely untrue, for sure, but I think the prospect of this income being repatriated anytime soon was extremely limited. Even the prospect of kind of a deemed repatriation that would lead to being taxed currently at some point, for example, as part of a transition to a territorial system, that would have likely been done at a very reduced rate, meaning the credits would be reduced as well. So I agree it wasn't zero, but I don't think the effects on future U.S. tax liability were necessarily that great. On the other hand, it's certainly true. You have a company like Apple or the other U.S. firms that are under investigation. A lot of them are owned to a fair extent by U.S. individuals as the shareholders. So if the company pays more tax to a foreign country, the U.S. shareholders, as indirect claimants on the corporate assets, they're less rich. So yes, there is certainly a possibility that this would have an adverse impact on U.S. interests, even if it's a slightly different kind. But in my view, there's kind of little ground for U.S. complaint, even if we're adversely affected, if it was done pursuant to a good faith view regarding EU law and EU policy interests. And again, EU law, certainly I don't feel like I or the Treasury are the best situated to judge that. But I think it is, you can try to make a judgment about EU policy interests simply because it happens all the time when another party does something that's adverse to you. It's a natural question to ask, might that be reasonable from that party's perspective? You're not really second guessing them. It's kind of a good faith type of inquiry. And to get ahead a little bit, I'm going to say I think that whether it was right or wrong under the law or as a matter of EU policy, there was kind of enough of an argument for it to be sufficiently in good faith that it's kind of questionable for the U.S. to get too wrought up about it. Anyway, let me give you a background on U.S. international tax policy debate. We really even have, for many years, have had kind of two warring sides, and I'll call them anti-tax and anti-tax avoidance. On the anti-tax side, obviously the U.S. multinational companies want to pay less. The Republicans want them to pay less to everyone, including to the U.S. And there are some academics who kind of take this side more for reasons relating, for example, the concern about tax competition and efficiency. The other side I call the anti-tax avoidance side. That has some Democrats, not all, for sure, because the Democrats are kind of more divided in this issue than Republicans. And it also has some academics, so you can see there are academics on both sides of this. Not that anyone other than the academics particularly cares. Anyway, on state aid, the state aid case, much more was heard from the anti-tax side. And this reflected that the U.S. companies were prominent among the targets, although I know of no evidence that there was bias against them. If kind of looking at big multinationals that did aggressive tax planning stuff, you're going to find a whole lot of American companies there. It's just sort of a fact about IP and tax planning and other things in these days. Anyway, it also, the U.S. response, that was really more on one side, even though the debate is often more kind of each side, also reflected the EC's decision to look far back and the red faces of the company's tax and accounting advisors who failed to anticipate it. Perhaps, and I'm certainly willing to concede the point because I'm not the right person to debate it, perhaps because of the novelty of the legal theories employed. Anyway, but I think the complexity of the underlying policy issues, the difficulty of really knowing who's right in a lot of ways is often underappreciated. And again, for me, this kind of suggests the U.S. saying, EU, you and EC, you resolve that, see what you think. Because even if the arguments for what the European Commission is doing are wrong, including from an EU self-interest standpoint, I think they're sufficiently within the ground of reasonable debate that it kind of would be sensible for the U.S. to say, well, our friends have decided to do this, and they're not, even if they let them resolve it for themselves, but they're not kind of in bad faith, targeting us for no reason. Anyway, so what's the first ambiguity? That's the meaning of source. And I think the U.S. distress reflects the view that this really was U.S. source income. Again, there are people in Cupertino and elsewhere who are doing these things. That's where the economic activity occurred that kind of generated all these large profits. So it's really U.S. source income. Why are you guys taxing this? But of course, the U.S. had decided as a matter of U.S. tax law, it wasn't U.S. source income, so that kind of undermines taking that approach. Obviously, the Treasury white paper didn't say, oh, this is really U.S. source income, because it really couldn't say that. But this was only really U.S. source income if you take an origin-based rather than a destination-based view of source. And we heard Bob Stack, for example, was just saying the market countries think that they have the right to tax profitable stuff that's sold there. That's a view that's been around since the beginning of the international tax regime that we've never really solidly resolved. Now, income seems to be an origin-based concept. Where was income created? Where was value created? Of course, that's what the BEPS project talks about. But income taxes don't always even try to follow it. And just to give an example, the U.S. has a rule for sourcing use of intellectual property. Intellectual property that's used in the U.S. creates U.S. source income. That's a destination concept. That's a where was it used, where the consumers concept. So we use these things ourselves. Now, even though the U.S. is an income tax, I don't think that prejudges the question of how you should judge source, because there's this whole debate. Of course, everyone else has both, but in the U.S. there's this whole debate about income tax versus consumption tax. That turns on all kinds of issues about how to think about weighting and deferral and things like that. These issues are really quite distinct from how we think about countries dividing up tax bases. They really turn on just very different issues. So just to give an example, in the U.S. there's been advocacy by Aviona, Clausing, and Durst of sales-based formulary apportionment for international tax. I wouldn't say, oh, that's a bad idea because that's using a destination concept, it's where the sale occurs. I'd say it's a good idea or a bad idea depending upon its effects. Obviously, the destination-based cash flow tax gives another example of that. So I think even though one has an income tax, both of those sets of ideas are out there, and you're not really going to resolve it formalistically by saying, income means origin means it has to be U.S. source income. So fundamentally, we have an ambiguous concept here. Either what it does mean and what it should mean and why are all very much up for grabs. Second question, taxing outbound. This is definitely a U.S. perspective. Was it a mistake for the U.S. to allow Apple to escape any current U.S. tax on its EU sales? So we'll never get those tax revenues unless the income is repatriated at a point when there is a positive tax in place on them, which is far from clear that it'll ever happen. Anyway, if we made a big mistake, then in a way the EU is helping us by the back door. Not directly, because of course the U.S. doesn't gain wealth or anything from 14 billion euros being paid to Ireland, if that's what happens. But because U.S. companies would now know this regime is there, it might affect their planning the next time around. So under this view that we really should have taxed that income, we're kind of being helped indirectly for the next time. But there's really no consensus on this either. In favor of taxing outbound, you have, partly due to the U.S. rules, I'll start with the second thing, efficiency grounds for taxing outbound rents. If companies are earning massive extra normal returns, you can kind of tax them without too much of efficiency consequence. Also, a lot of why would one want in the U.S. to tax Apple? A lot of it has to do with the fact that we have an ability to pay paste income tax, and due to some quirks in our rules, we're never going to tax it unless we do it at the company level. For example, Steve Jobs famously got his $1 a year salary, died with vastly appreciated shares of stock, and they got under our crazy rules, step up in basis of death, so that if he bought the shares for $1 and his kids sold them for $1 billion, there'd be no U.S. tax. That's a feature of our rules that's rather silly, but once it's there, taxing Apple is kind of the only shot you get at taxing someone like Steve Jobs, who I have nothing against, but he was a very rich person, so you might want him to share in the cost of government. Anyway, but there are arguments on the other side, taxing outbound, and these underlie advocacy of the DBCFT. There's a lot of electivity about where you whether you use a U.S. company or not. Source is very manipulable. There are very reasonable arguments to the extent that if you try to tax this outbound stuff in foreign sales, you're not really going to get it. You're going to create more problems than it's worth. So this, again, is a legitimate debate. Argument 3, which really gets more to what the EU should think about its own self, or EC, or what EU countries should think about their own self-interest individually, collectively. I don't know if I don't know if Ireland, quote, granted deals or not, because again, that's for the EU and EC people to decide. But I could certainly see if Ireland did deliberately grant deals here in order to get some employment, that it was probably smart. They get some benefit out of it. Could have they gotten more? I have no reason to think they could have. But unless they could have gotten more, you could certainly argue that Ireland did a good thing for itself. But was it hurting the EU? I think that's ambiguous. Economists will often say that kind of a small open economy where you don't have much market power, you can't really try to tax, you shouldn't really try to tax normal returns on inbound stuff, because the foreigners, the outsiders, won't bear the instance of the tax. They'll simply charge more, and it'll be domestics who bear the instance of the tax. So under some conditions, trying to tax extra profits from inbound sales doesn't really make any sense. You're not really going to get anywhere by doing it. But on the other hand, again, suppose Apple was earning rents, and suppose the EU collectively had monopsony power. Then it's possible that the EU could have extracted some value from Apple by taxing it that would really get revenues, the incidence of which was borne, I guess, ultimately by Apple's shareholders. So that's possible as well. there's really no consensus about when tax competition, as opposed to kind of coordinating to prevent it, having the EC stop Ireland or Luxembourg or other countries within it from doing things. There's really no consensus about when this is collectively beneficial for the set of jurisdictions as a whole and when it's not. Next, ambiguity, and here this is more again because I'm doing a U.S. perspective here. Foreign-to-foreign profit shifting. So does the U.S. benefit when U.S. companies do this, foreign-to-foreign tax planning? I refer here, for example, to Apple's, as far as the U.S. was concerned, locating the income in Ireland, but then not even paying Ireland's rate, having a lot of the income tax nowhere. Well, this is ambiguous. The argument for allowing your companies to do foreign-to-foreign profit shifting is why benefit foreign countries' treasuries? Wouldn't you be happier to have the money stay in the pockets of U.S. shareholders who own the U.S. companies, or if it does turn out in terms of foreign tax credits, the U.S. fisc? That's an argument in favor of being quite happy when your companies do foreign-to-foreign profit shifting to avoid paying foreign taxes. But on the other hand, foreign-to-foreign tax planning can encourage domestically adverse base erosion and profit shifting. So once again, it's kind of a question of whose hide it really comes out of, and it's very hard to say. I think this is why CFC rules are so widespread. CFC rules, often what they really do is they address stuff that ends up in tax havens or that's passive, and so you know it will end up in a tax haven. So everyone kind of has these rules because there's a notion that it indirectly protects the domestic tax base, but there's a lot of dissensus about how tough or how mild or how not at all they should be. Another example of the same thing is diverse U.S. versus non-U.S. views of check the box. So we, in the late 90s, I would guess most of this audience knows about our check the box rules, created rules that made it quite easy for U.S. companies, much easier than it used to have been for U.S. companies to avoid foreign taxes by doing deals between affiliates that no longer would yield subpart F income because the U.S. system wouldn't, quote, know that they occurred. Subpart F is our set of CFC rules. I remember in the U.S. this whole debate about how, oh, did we make a mistake? Did we, quote, give it away? Was it a good thing after all? I remember coming to the EU and talking to EU tax academics, and they were coming about how diabolically clever the U.S. was to do this so that U.S. companies could avoid EU taxes. And I was thinking, gee, were we that clever? I'm not sure we knew. Anyway, but it's also ambiguous whether it was clever or not. Let me just give one last ambiguity, and this goes right to the theme of this conference, retroactivity. And I should have put that in scare quotes. So much of the controversiality reflects the EC's aggressively looking as far back as it did, and also perhaps using novel theories. And this certainly might prospectively increase business uncertainty, even in the absence of impermissible legal retroactivity. But there's another side to this. Uncertainty is not the only issue. Inducing business to anticipate future decisions can have desirable incentive effects. Indeed, inducing them to anticipate the use of novel theories also can have desirable incentive effects. There's a huge U.S. tax policy literature on this, and I named some of the people there who have pointed out that there are circumstances in which having taxpayers have to anticipate what's going to happen next can have desirable incentive effects. In some cases, this is conditioned on the decision that they have to anticipate actually being a good one, and so that you'd have to like the new policy in order to like the anticipation. But if you do like the anticipation, it can have desirable incentive effects. There's also a related debate in which U.S. tax policy writers have written about backward-looking judicial and administrative action to discourage aggressive tax planning, including possibly through the use of novel theories. And again, a number of people have, including, I'm far too modest to read all those names, because they're friends of mine. At least a couple. Anyway, there have been a lot of writers, there have been quite a few writers who have pointed out, and admittedly this is very specific to the U.S. context and where it's happened there, so I wouldn't automatically import it to what's going on in the EU, but they've pointed out that in many settings the incentive effects in the retroactive application can be, at least in their judgment, desirable. I said theirs can be desirable. Anyway, last thing I'll say is what to expect next from the U.S. Well, as you probably all know, we're sort of in uncharted waters now. So it makes it very hard to know what's going on in our country or what will happen. The current administration likes to say America first. It's evinced times startling hostility to the EU, and I'm restraining saying more here, but there does seem to be a notion that it's much more pleasant to deal with, dictators are inherent, I won't say it. I'll just leave it unsaid. Anyway, but this administration, I think this is something that almost everyone even would have to agree with. Its policy bandwidth and its expertise are unprecedentedly limited. They really, for example, in the U.S. Treasury, there's kind of no staff there at the senior levels. No, there are the junior, not the professional career levels, yes, but you really need people at the senior levels. There's just not much there, and I don't know when or if there will be. So my guess is that this greatly reduces the likelihood of any significant U.S. response to the state aid cases. I'm not referring to like filing a brief that tells the ECJ that you can no longer hold for Ireland without looking like you back down to the U.S., whether that's true or not. I'm not denying the possibility that we might file such a brief. It'll probably be written in crayon, though. Anyway, that was a joke. I would guess that the lack of bandwidth greatly reduces the likelihood of any significant U.S. response. Thanks.